The classroom on Nexus Prime station hummed with the quiet tension of 43 cadets waiting for their instructor to continue the lesson. And Lieutenant Commander Nicole Hayes stood at the holographic display with her arms crossed, watching the tactical scenario play out in blue and red light across the dark surface. She was a small woman by human standards and looked even smaller next to the massive Centauri warriors who filled the back rows of the academy classroom. But her voice carried clearly when she spoke. The boarding action failed because the team leader prioritized speed over preparation, she said, gesturing at the frozen hologram where a dozen soldiers floated dead in the simulated void. 3 minutes of reconnaissance would have revealed the trap. A snort came from the back row. Loud and deliberate, Nicole paused but did not turn around, because she knew exactly who had made the sound, and she had been dealing with Cadet Brandon Velrix's disruptions for 3 weeks now. "Do you have a question, Cadet Velrix?" she asked. Brandon stood up, all 7 feet of him covered in the dark blue scales that marked him as Centauri warrior caste, and his voice boomed across the classroom like thunder. "I have an observation." "Human," he said, putting particular emphasis on the last word as if it were an insult. "Your solution to every scenario is to hide and wait and sneak like a coward." Several alien cadets laughed, and Nicole saw a few human students shift uncomfortably in their seats. She had heard worse in her years of service, much worse, and Brandon's attempt to humiliate her barely registered as an annoyance. The mission objective was to secure the ship with minimal casualties, Nicole replied calmly. "The team that waits and observes loses 3 soldiers. The team that rushes in loses everyone." Typical human thinking. Brandon's voice grew louder as he walked down the aisle toward the front of the class, and Nicole noticed his hands clenching into fists. "You teach fear and call it tactics. You teach weakness and call it strategy." The classroom went quiet now, because every cadet could sense that this had crossed a line from simple disagreement into open challenge. Nicole turned to face Brandon fully, her expression unchanged. "Cadet Velrix, you will sit down and allow me to continue the lesson," she said. "No." Brandon stopped 3 meters from her, towering over her small frame. "I will not sit here and pretend that a human who has never seen real combat has anything to teach warriors." A Centauri cadet in the 3rd row whistled, which was their species equivalent of gasping in shock. "I have asked you politely to sit down," Nicole said, and her voice remained level and quiet. "This is your final warning, or what?" Brandon took another step forward, close enough now that Nicole had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You will write a report? File a complaint? Run away like your kind always does when faced with real strength?" He reached out with one massive hand, clearly intending to grab her shoulder and physically move her aside. And that was when he made his fatal mistake. What happened next occurred so quickly that most of the cadets missed it entirely. Brandon's hand was still moving toward Nicole's shoulder when she shifted her weight, turned her body at a precise angle, and caught his wrist with both of her smaller hands. In the same fluid motion, she redirected his momentum and stepped to the side. The laws of physics did the rest. Brandon's own strength and forward motion worked against him as Nicole guided his arm down in a cross, adding just enough force to complete the arc. And suddenly the massive Centauri warrior was airborne. He hit the deck plating with a sound like a shuttle crash landing, the impact driving the air from his lungs and rattling his bones. And before he could process what had happened, he found himself flat on his back, staring up at the ceiling. The entire sequence from grab to impact had taken less than 2 seconds. Nicole stood over him, not even breathing hard, and looked down at his shocked face with the same calm expression she had worn throughout the confrontation. The lesson, Cadet Velrix, is that size and strength mean nothing without skill and control, she said. Now get up, return to your seat, and do not interrupt my class again. Brandon lay there gasping, his pride more damaged than his body, and the classroom remained absolutely silent. No one laughed now. No one even seemed to breathe. The human cadets stared in shock, because they had known Lieutenant Commander Hayes was competent, but they had not expected this. And the alien cadets stared, because they had just watched a small human woman casually throw a Zentari warrior across the room like he weighed nothing. Lisa Chun, a human cadet in the front row who had trained under Nicole before coming to the academy, allowed herself a small smile. She had tried to warn the other students that their instructor was not to be underestimated. But no one had listened. Brandon slowly pushed himself to his feet. His face flushed dark purple with humiliation, and he looked at Nicole with an expression somewhere between rage and disbelief. "You attacked me," he said, his voice shaking. "I will report this. You will be removed from teaching." "I defended myself when you initiated unwanted physical contact," Nicole replied, pointing at the small recorder device mounted in the corner of the classroom. "The Academy records all classroom interactions. The footage will show exactly what happened." Brandon opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again as he realized the truth of her words. He had grabbed her first. He had made this physical. She had simply responded. "Return to your seat, cadet," Nicole said again, "or leave my classroom. Those are your only options." For a long moment, Brandon stood there, torn between his desire to continue the confrontation and his growing awareness that he had already lost. And finally, his warrior training overcame his wounded pride. He turned and walked back to his seat, moving stiffly, and the other cadets parted to let him pass like he carried some contagious disease. Nicole watched him go, then turned back to the holographic display as if nothing unusual had happened. "Now," she said, bringing up a new tactical scenario, "let us discuss proper reconnaissance protocols and why 3 minutes of preparation can save 30 lives." She began explaining the next scenario in the same calm, measured tone she had used throughout the entire class. And the cadets scrambled to take notes, but everyone in that room knew that something fundamental had changed. The quiet human instructor, who they had dismissed or ignored or mocked, had just demonstrated that she was far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. And the casual ease with which she had handled, Brandon suggested that she had been holding back the entire time as the lesson continued. Lisa Chun glanced back at Brandon and saw him staring at Nicole with an expression she could not quite read. It was not quite anger anymore, though some of that remained. It looked almost like fear, mixed with something else, something like dawning understanding that he had made a terrible mistake. When the class finally ended 90 minutes later and the cadets filed out in unusual silence, Brandon remained in his seat for several minutes. Nicole gathered her teaching materials and prepared to leave, and she noticed him still sitting there but said nothing. Finally, he stood and walked toward the exit. And as he passed her, he stopped. "This is not over," he said quietly. Nicole looked at him with those calm, unreadable eyes. "For your sake, Cadet Velrix." "I hope it is," she replied. Then she walked out, leaving Brandon alone in the empty classroom with his shattered pride and the growing certainty that he had just challenged someone far beyond his ability to defeat. Commander Jig Morrison received the alert on his personal communicator exactly 17 minutes after the incident in Nicole Hayes' classroom, and he knew before reading the message that this was going to become a major problem. Station security had flagged an altercation between an instructor and a cadet, which was unusual enough, but when he saw that the instructor was Nicole and the cadet was Brandon Velrix, he closed his eyes and muttered a curse under his breath. He had known something like this was coming. Brandon had been pushing boundaries for weeks, testing Nicole with increasingly aggressive challenges to her authority. And Jake had watched the situation develop with growing concern, because he knew things about Lieutenant Commander Hayes that very few people in the academy were cleared to know. Now those secrets might have to come out. He found Nicole in her small office, adjacent to the main classroom, reviewing lesson plans for the next day as if nothing unusual had occurred. And she looked up when he entered, but did not seem surprised to see him. "Commander Morrison," she said. Standing and offering the traditional salute, Jake returned the salute and gestured for her to sit. "Tell me what happened," he said. Nicole explained the incident in precise, clinical terms, describing Brandon's escalating disruption, his physical approach, and her defensive response. She spoke without emotion or embellishment, simply presenting the facts. "I have submitted the classroom recorder footage to your office," she finished. "It shows clearly that Cadet Velrix initiated physical contact, and I responded with appropriate defensive measures." Jake nodded, because he had already reviewed the footage and everything, Nicole said, matched exactly what the recording showed. "The Zentari ambassador has filed a formal complaint," he said. Watching her face for any reaction, Nicole's expression did not change. "I expected he would," she replied. "He is demanding your immediate removal from teaching duties," Jake continued. "He claims you used excessive force against the student and that you pose a danger to the cadets. And what do you think, Commander?" Jake leaned back in his chair and studied the woman sitting across from him. This small, quiet instructor, who had served with such distinction that her service record was still classified at the highest levels. "I think," he said slowly, "that you could have broken every bone in Cadet Velrix's body, and he would never have seen it coming." "I think you showed remarkable restraint." Nicole said nothing, but something in her eyes softened slightly. "However," Jake sighed, "the Zentari representative is not the only one calling for action. 3 other species ambassadors have joined his complaint, and the Academy Board wants a formal inquiry." "I understand, Nicole." Jake leaned forward now, his voice dropping to something more personal than professional. "They are going to demand access to your full service record. They will want to know who you really are and what you did before you came here." For the first time since he had entered the office, Nicole's calm facade cracked slightly. "That information is classified for good reasons," she said quietly. "I know," Jake replied. "But unless you want to resign, unless you want to walk away from teaching, you're gonna have to let them see at least part of it." Nicole stood and walked to the window that looked out over the station's main concourse, watching the flow of cadets and instructors and support staff moving through their daily routines. She had come to the academy precisely to escape the attention that came with her past, to find some small corner of the military where she could serve without the weight of her reputation following her everywhere she had wanted to teach, to pass on the skills she had learned through blood and pain and loss, to help the next generation survive the conflicts that were inevitable in a galaxy where hundreds of species competed for resources and territory. But standing here now, looking at her reflection in the transparent aluminum, she realized that the past was not something she could simply leave behind. "What will happen to Cadet Velrix?" she asked. "That depends on the inquiry," Jake said. "If the board finds that you acted inappropriately, he will likely be cleared, and you will be dismissed. If they find that he initiated the confrontation, he will face disciplinary action." Nicole turned back to face him. "And if I refuse to allow my service record to be unsealed, then the board will assume you have something to hide, and they will likely rule against you without seeing any evidence." It was a trap, Nicole realized, and not a subtle one. She could protect her privacy and lose her position, or she could reveal the truth about her past and face whatever consequences came from that revelation. "Very well," she said finally. "I will authorize the release of my service record to the inquiry board, but only to them and only for the duration of the investigation." Jake nodded, looking relieved. "I will make the arrangements," he said, standing to leave. "The inquiry is scheduled for tomorrow at 1400 hours. Be prepared to answer difficult questions. After he left, Nicole sat alone in her office for a long time. Thinking about the missions and the battles and the friends she had lost, she thought about the Kreth massacre, where she had led a rescue team into hell itself and brought 300 prisoners home. She thought about the 6 hours she had spent holding a defensive position alone while her team evacuated civilians, facing down creatures that had killed entire squads of enhanced alien warriors. She thought about the medals she had refused and the promotions she had declined because she did not want to be a symbol or a hero or a poster child for human exceptionalism. She had just wanted to serve, to do her duty, to help where she could. Now all of that was going to come out, examined and discussed and judged by people who had never faced real combat, who had never made the choices she had made or carried the weight she had carried. Meanwhile, in the station's medical bay, Brandon Velrix sat on an examination table while a Thorian medic scanned his ribs for fractures. "You are fortunate," the medic said in its whistling voice. "No broken bones. You will have extensive bruising, but nothing permanent." Brandon barely heard the words, because his mind was still replaying those 2 seconds in the classroom when the small human instructor had thrown him across the room. Like a child tossing a toy, he had trained since childhood in Xanthari combat arts. He had won tournaments and defeated opponents twice his size. He was considered one of the finest warriors of his generation, and Nicole Hayes had made him look like an untrained novice. How did she do that? He muttered, more to himself than to the medic. "Pardon?" The medic asked. Brandon shook his head. "Nothing," after the medic finished and left him alone. Brandon pulled out his personal datapad and began searching for information about Lieutenant Commander Nicole Hayes. What he found was frustrating in its incompleteness. She had served in Earth's military for 12 years before transferring to the academy as an instructor. Her service record showed a series of commendations and medals, but most of the details were classified. There were references to special operations and deep space reconnaissance, but nothing specific. The few public records available showed only that she had been assigned to high-risk missions and had survived situations where her entire team had been killed. Brandon stared at the fragmentary information and felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest. He had assumed Nicole was just another academy instructor, someone who had never seen real combat and had been given a teaching position because she was competent at theory but useless in practice. Now he was beginning to suspect that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment when his fellow Xanthari cadets found him later that evening. They mocked him mercilessly for being beaten by a human female. "Did she hurt you badly?" one asked with barely suppressed laughter. "Do you need us to protect you from the scary instructor?" Another added. Brandon endured their mockery in silence, because Xanthari culture valued strength above all else, and showing weakness was the greatest shame a warrior could bear. But as he lay in his bunk that night, unable to sleep because his ribs ached and his pride hurt worse, he made a decision. He would attend the inquiry tomorrow, and he would demand that the board reveal everything about Nicole Hayes. He would prove that she was dangerous, that she had used excessive force, that she should not be teaching, and if his own honor was damaged in the process, well, at least he would bring her down with him. He did not yet understand that some truths, once revealed, cannot be controlled, or that learning who Nicole Hayes really was might be the most terrifying lesson of his life. The inquiry board convened in the station's main conference room at exactly 1400 hours, and the 7 members took their seats behind a long table, while cadets and instructors filled the observation gallery to capacity. Brandon Velrix sat in the front row with his Xanthari advocate, a stern-faced warrior named Keth, who had served as a military judge for 20 years. Nicole sat alone on the opposite side of the room, having declined legal representation because she believed the facts would speak for themselves. "Commander, Jake Morrison stood at the front as the presiding officer, and he called the session to order with a sharp tap of his gavel. This inquiry will determine whether Lieutenant Commander Nicole Hayes used excessive force in defending herself against Cadet Brandon Velrix, he announced. Cadet Velrix, you may present your testimony. Brandon stood and walked to the witness position, and he had spent the entire night rehearsing what he would say. Honored members of the board, he began. I admit that I challenged Instructor Hayes during class. I admit that I questioned her teaching methods. He paused for effect. However, when I attempted to make a point about human weakness through a simple physical demonstration, she responded with a combat technique that could have killed me. Murmurs rippled through the observation gallery. She threw me across the classroom with such force that I sustained injuries to my ribs and back. Brandon continued. This was not defensive action. This was an attack by someone with extensive combat training against a student who was simply trying to understand the lessons. He sat down, and Keth nodded approvingly at him. Jake Morrison turned to Nicole. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, you may respond. Nicole stood and walked to the witness position without hurry, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly through the room despite its quiet tone. I would like to present evidence, she said. Jake nodded, and the main holographic display activated. The classroom recorder footage began to play, showing Brandon standing and making his initial challenge, walking down the aisle toward Nicole, and finally reaching out to grab her shoulder. The footage showed in perfect clarity that Brandon had initiated physical contact and that Nicole's response had been a single fluid defensive motion. As you can see, Nicole said calmly, Cadet Velrix grabbed my arm without permission or warning. In such situations, Academy regulations authorize instructors to use reasonable force to defend themselves. That technique was not reasonable. Brandon shouted from his seat. That was the move of a trained killer. The room went silent. Nicole looked at Brandon with an expression that might have been pity. Yes, she said simply. The single word hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. One of the board members, a Thorian admiral named Vexter, leaned forward. Lieutenant Commander, are you admitting to having training beyond standard military instruction? I am not admitting anything, Nicole replied. I am stating a fact that is already in my service record. Then perhaps, said Ambassador Keth, Brandon's advocate, we should examine that service record in detail. Jake Morrison had been dreading this moment. Much of Lieutenant Commander Hayes' service record is classified, he said carefully, then declassify it. Keth demanded. The board has the authority to review any materials relevant to this inquiry. Jake looked at Nicole, giving her one last chance to object, but she simply nodded. Very well, he said. But this will require clearance from Fleet Command. He activated his communicator and spoke quietly for several minutes, and the room waited in tense silence. Finally, the main display flickered, and a new figure appeared via holographic transmission. Admiral Catherine Walsh, one of the highest-ranking officers in the human fleet, looked out at the assembled board with stern eyes. I have been following this inquiry, she said without preamble, and I have authorized the release of Lieutenant Commander Hayes' full service record to this board only. Under the strictest security protocols, she tapped something on her, and then data began flowing across the display. The board members leaned forward to read, and as they absorbed the information, their expressions changed from curiosity to shock to something approaching awe. Brandon could not see the full display from where he sat, but he could see the reaction it provoked, and a cold dread began to settle in his stomach. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, Admiral Walsh continued, served with the Earth Special Operations Force for 8 years before requesting transfer to teaching duties. She brought up an image of a burning space station during the Kreth massacre. She led a team of 12 operatives into a heavily fortified position where 300 human and alien prisoners were being held for execution. The image shifted to show scattered bodies and destroyed equipment. Her team fought through 8 levels of defenders, losing 6 members in the process, and established a defensive perimeter around the prisoners. Another image appeared, showing Nicole in combat armor covered in blood and carbon scoring, when Kreth reinforcements arrived and cut off their escape route. Lieutenant Commander Hayes ordered her remaining team to evacuate the prisoners while she held the position alone. The room was completely silent now, everyone transfixed by the images appearing on the display. For 6 hours, she defended a single corridor against a Kreth hunting pack that numbered over 40 warriors, Admiral Walsh said, and her voice held a note of respect that bordered on reverence. The Kreth are considered among the most dangerous combat species in known space, she continued. Enhanced strength, advanced weaponry, centuries of military tradition. Typical engagement doctrine suggests that a Kreth hunting pack requires at least a platoon of regular troops to engage with acceptable casualties. She paused. To let that sink in, Lieutenant Commander Hayes faced them alone and survived. Brandon felt the blood draining from his boy face. When reinforcements finally arrived, they found her still holding the position, Admiral Walsh said. She had sustained 17 wounds, exhausted her ammunition, and was fighting with improvised weapons. The corridor behind her contained 243 enemy dead. The number echoed through the chamber like thunder. She was recommended for the Star of Valor, the highest military honor our species can bestow. Admiral Walsh continued. She declined it. She declined 3 promotions and a position on Fleet Command staff because, in her words, she wanted to teach others how to survive rather than continuing to fight. The Admiral looked directly at Brandon through the holographic display. So when Cadet Velrix asks whether Lieutenant Commander Hayes is a trained killer, the answer is yes. She's one of the most effective combat operatives in human history. She turned her gaze to the board, and when you ask whether she used excessive force in defending herself, I would point out that a simple grab from someone of Cadet Velrix's size and strength could have dislocated her shoulder or worse. Admiral Walsh leaned forward, and her voice dropped to something cold and hard. The fact that the cadet sustained only minor bruising demonstrates exactly how much restraint the lieutenant commander showed. If she had wanted to hurt him, if she had responded with even a fraction of the force she is capable of using, we would be discussing funeral arrangements instead of holding an inquiry. The Admiral's image vanished, leaving the board members staring at the data still scrolling across the display. Brandon sat frozen in his chair, unable to process what he had just heard. He had grabbed the arm of someone who had single-handedly killed over 200 Kreth warriors. He had challenged the competence of someone who had led impossible rescue missions and survived situations that would have killed entire companies of regular soldiers. He had called her a coward in front of her students. This woman, who had held a position alone against 40 enhanced aliens for 6 hours while her team escaped. The realization of what he had done crashed over him like a physical wave. And for the first time in his life, Brandon Velrix understood what true terror felt like. Not the fear of losing a fight or sustaining injury, but the bone-deep terror of realizing that he had insulted and attacked someone who could have ended his life without effort and had chosen mercy instead. Jake Morrison looked at the board members. "Does anyone have further questions?" He asked. The Thorian admiral who had spoken earlier shook his head slowly, still staring at the service record. "I believe," he said quietly, "that we have seen enough." The board members conferred in whispers for less than a minute before announcing their decision. This inquiry finds that Lieutenant Commander Nicole Hayes acted with appropriate restraint when defending herself against unwanted physical contact. the senior board member announced. Cadet Brandon Velrix is found to have violated Academy conduct regulations and will be placed on disciplinary probation. She looked at Brandon with something between disappointment and disgust. Furthermore, the cadet will issue a formal public apology to Lieutenant Commander Hayes and will be required to attend additional training on appropriate instructor-student interactions. Brandon barely heard the words, because he was still staring at Nicole. This small, quiet woman who had shown him more mercy than he had deserved. Nicole stood and saluted the board, then turned to leave the chamber. As she passed Brandon's seat, she paused for just a moment. The lesson. Cadet Velrix, she said softly, so only he could hear, is that the most dangerous warriors are often the ones who choose not to fight. Then she walked out, leaving Brandon alone with the crushing weight of why. 3 weeks after the inquiry, Brandon Velrix sat in Nicole Hayes' classroom and actually listened for the first time since the term had begun. And he found himself shocked by how much he had missed while wrapped in his own arrogance. Nicole was explaining a complex multi-vector assault scenario, using the holographic display to show how 3 smaller forces could coordinate to defeat a larger enemy, through timing and position rather than direct confrontation. The key is not individual strength, she said, highlighting certain positions on the map. The key is making the enemy divide their attention until they cannot effectively defend any position. Brandon took notes, his stylus moving rapidly across his datapad, and he noticed that several other alien cadets were doing the same. The atmosphere in the classroom had changed completely. Where before students had whispered and joked during Nicole's lessons, now they hung on her every word, because everyone had heard about the inquiry, and everyone knew what she had done during her years of active service. She was not just an instructor anymore. She was a living legend who had survived impossible odds and was willing to share that knowledge. Cadet Velrix, Nicole said. And Brandon's head snapped up. What is the primary weakness in the defender's position? Brandon studied the hologram carefully, applying the principles she had been teaching. The communication relay, he said after a moment. If the attackers disable it first, the defenders cannot coordinate their response. Nicole nodded. Correct. Without coordination, superior numbers become a liability because units cannot support each other effectively. She moved on to the next part of the lesson, and Brandon felt a strange sense of satisfaction at having answered correctly later that week. Commander Morrison announced the Academy's annual combat simulation exercise, a major event where cadets would be divided into teams and evaluated on their tactical performance. This year's scenario, Jake said to the assembled students, will be urban combat with civilian rescue elements. Your team leaders have been selected based on academic performance and leadership potential. He brought up the roster on the main display. Team Alpha will be led by Cadet Brandon Velrix, he announced. Brandon straightened in surprise, because he had not expected to be chosen for a leadership role after his disciplinary probation. Team Beta will be led by Lieutenant Commander Hayes. Jake continued. The room erupted in excited whispers, because having an instructor lead a team was unusual, and having Nicole Hayes lead a team was extraordinary. Brandon felt his stomach tighten. He would be competing directly against the woman who had thrown him across a classroom, the woman who had killed over 200 enemies in a single battle. This was either an opportunity to prove himself or a chance to be completely humiliated. The teams were assigned the following day, and Brandon found himself with a diverse group. 2 Xanthari warriors like himself, 3 human cadets, a Thorian engineer, and 2 members of the insectoid Vrex species. His first instinct was to divide them by species and assign roles based on physical capabilities. But then he remembered Nicole's lessons about coordination and decided to try a different approach. We will train together, he told his team at their first meeting. All of us learning each other's strengths and weaknesses. We will not win through individual power, but through working as a unified force, his Xanthari teammates looked skeptical. But they agreed to try. Meanwhile, Nicole worked with her own team, which was smaller but included Lisa Chun and several cadets who had been her students for multiple terms. Brandon watched from a distance as she put them through drills that emphasized communication and adaptability. And he tried to copy her methods with his own team. The days before the simulation passed quickly, and Brandon found himself staying up late to study tactical theory, reviewing old battles and analyzing what had worked and what had failed. He began to understand why Nicole taught the way she did, why she emphasized preparation over aggression and coordination over individual heroics. The day of the simulation arrived, and both teams gathered in the massive training facility that took up an entire section of the station. The scenario was brutally complex, an urban environment with multiple levels, civilian NPCs scattered throughout, and enemy forces that would adapt to the team's tactics. Team Alpha would defend while Team Beta attacked, with success measured not just by defeating the enemy, but by protecting the civilians. Begin, the simulation controller announced, and both teams moved into position. Brandon deployed his forces carefully, placing his Xanthari warriors at key choke points but keeping the rest of his team mobile and ready to respond to threats. He had learned from Nicole's lessons that static defense was vulnerable to coordinated assault. Team Beta's attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, exactly as Nicole had taught in her classroom scenarios. And Brandon felt a surge of pride when his team responded smoothly. His human cadets identified the attack vectors and redirected forces, while his Thorian engineer established communication links, and his Rex teammates used their natural climbing abilities to establish high observation points. The battle was intense and chaotic, but Brandon kept his head and focused on coordination rather than trying to personally defeat every enemy. Then the simulation threw in its twist. Civilian NPCs suddenly appeared in the crossfire. Trapped between the two teams, Brandon faced an immediate decision. He could continue his defensive strategy and likely win the engagement, but civilians would be caught in the fighting, or he could redirect forces to protect the civilians, which would weaken his defensive positions. For a brief moment, he considered the tactical advantages of each option, calculating victory chances and acceptable losses. Then he remembered Admiral Walsh's words at the inquiry, remembered that Nicole had risked everything to protect prisoners who were not even her own species. All teams. Priority change. He broadcast on the team channel. Civilian protection is now primary objective. Winning the engagement is secondary. His Xanthari teammates questioned the order, but he overrode them. "We are warriors," he said, "and warriors protect those who cannot protect themselves." The team shifted focus, creating protective corridors for the civilians even as it meant giving up advantageous positions. Team Beta pressed their attack, and Brandon saw Nicole's tactical genius in every move they made. They exploited the openings his team had created, struck at weak points with perfect timing, and forced him into increasingly difficult choices between defending territory and protecting civilians. But something unexpected happened as Brandon's team prioritized civilian safety, adapting on the fly and working together to shield the NPCs while maintaining defensive positions. Team Beta began to slow their assault. Nicole was teaching them something. Brandon realized she was not trying to win decisively. She was creating a situation where both teams had to balance aggression with protection. Victory with mercy. The simulation ran for 2 hours, and when it finally ended, both teams were exhausted. The scoring system analyzed their performance, calculating everything from tactical decisions to civilian casualties to team coordination. Commander Morrison reviewed the results and announced them to both teams. Team Beta achieved the primary objective with minimal civilian Casualties, he said. Team Alpha successfully defended key positions while prioritizing civilian protection. He paused. However, the most significant result is not in the scores, but in what both teams demonstrated: that effective military operations require more than defeating the enemy. They require protecting those who cannot protect themselves. He looked directly at Brandon, Cadet Velrix. Your decision to prioritize civilian safety over tactical advantage cost you the victory in conventional terms. But it demonstrated the kind of judgment we need in real commanders. Brandon felt something shift inside him. A fundamental change in how he understood what it meant to be a warrior after the simulation. As both teams were leaving the training facility, Brandon found Nicole near the exit. "Lieutenant Commander," he said. And she turned to face him. "I wanted to thank you," he continued, feeling awkward and uncertain because he had never been good with apologies or admissions of. Nicole waited patiently. "I was wrong about you," Brandon said, finally. "About humans, about what makes a good warrior. About everything." He met her eyes. "I challenged you because I thought you were weak. But you are the strongest person I have ever met." Nicole was quiet for a moment. "Strength is not about how much force you can bring to bear, Cadet Velrix," she said. "It is about knowing when to use that force and when to show restraint." "I understand that now," Brandon replied. "And I wondered if you would be willing, if you might consider training me properly." He saw a surprise flicker across her face. "I am already your instructor," she said. "I know," Brandon nodded. "But before I was not really listening. I want to learn what you have to teach, to understand how you think about tactics and combat and leadership." Nicole studied him for a long moment, and Brandon could not read her expression finally. She nodded slowly. "Very well," she said. "Report to Training Room 7 tomorrow at 0600. Bring your team with you, my team?" Brandon asked in surprise. "You made good decisions today," Nicole replied. "But good decisions mean nothing without proper execution. We will work on turning your team into the kind of unit that can handle any situation." She started to walk away, then paused. "And Cadet Velrix? Tomorrow we start." 6 weeks after the simulation exercise, Brandon Velrix had become a different cadet entirely. And everyone at the academy noticed the change. He arrived early to Nicole's classes and stayed late to ask questions. He helped other students understand complex tactical concepts. He trained with his team every day under Neka's supervision as fellow Zentari cadets mocked him at first for becoming the human's pet warrior. But they stopped when they saw how much he had improved in actual combat. Drills the morning, the distress call came through. Brandon was in Training Room 7 with Nicole and his team, working through a complex close-quarters combat scenario. Commander Morrison to Lieutenant Commander Hayes. The announcement crackled through the room's communication system. "Report to command immediately. We have a situation." Nicole's expression shifted instantly from instructor to combat operative. "Continue the drill," she told Brandon's team. Then headed for the door. Brandon followed her without asking permission. When they reached the command center, they found Jake Morrison coordinating with several fleet officers. And the main display showed a civilian mining station approximately 3 hours away. "We received this 15 minutes ago," Jake said, bringing up a distress transmission. The voice that came through was human, terrified and speaking rapidly. "This is Station Meridian 7 requesting immediate assistance. We are under attack by unknown hostiles. They have breached the outer sections and are moving toward residential areas. We have over 400 civilians, including families and children. Please, anyone who can hear this, we need help now." The transmission cut off in a burst of static. "Fleet Command is dispatching ships," Jake said. "But the nearest combat-ready vessel is 6 hours out." He looked at Nicole. "We have the Academy's rapid response team on standby, but they are training cadets, not experienced combat troops. Then we supplement them with experienced personnel, Nicole said immediately. How many instructors are combat certified? 4, including you, Jake replied. Not nearly enough for a hostage rescue against an unknown number of hostiles. Brandon stepped forward. Commander, request permission to volunteer. Jake looked at him in surprise. Cadet Velrix, this is not a simulation. This is real combat with real casualties. I understand that. Sir, Brandon said, that those civilians need help now. And waiting for fleet ships means more people will die. Nicole turned to study Brandon, and he met her gaze steadily. I have been training for this, he said to her. You have been teaching me what it means to be a real warrior. Let me prove I have learned. For a moment, Nicole was silent, and Brandon could see her weighing the risks. Then she nodded. Commander Morrison, I recommend we take a mixed team of instructors and senior cadets, she said. Cadet Velrix and his team have demonstrated exceptional coordination and judgment. They are ready. Jake looked uncertain, but the distress call was still playing on loop in the background. That terrified voice begging for help. Very well, he said finally. Lieutenant Commander Hayes, you have tactical command. Assemble your team and deploy within the hour. The next 45 minutes passed in a blur of preparation. Nicole gathered her team, herself, 3 other combat-certified instructors, Brandon, and his entire training team. Listen carefully, she told them as they suited up in combat armor. Pirates expect easy targets. They expect civilians to panic and security forces to be overwhelmed. She brought up a schematic of Station Meridian 7. We will hit them hard and fast, using their own expectations against them. They will not expect a coordinated military response this quickly. She divided the team into 3 groups. Team 1 will secure the docking bay and establish a defensive position, she said, pointing to Lisa Chun, who had requested to come along. Team 2 will evacuate civilians from the residential sections. She looked at Brandon. Team 3 will be with me. We are going after the hostiles directly. Brandon felt his pulse quicken but kept his expression calm. The transport flight to Station Meridian 7 took 3 hours, and Nicole used the time to brief them on hostage rescue protocols, engagement rules, and contingency plans. Brandon listened intently, absorbing every detail. When they docked with the damaged station, they could hear weapons fire echoing through the corridors. Move out, Nicole said, and the teams deployed smoothly. Team 1 secured the docking bay within minutes, establishing defensive positions and setting up a medical triage area. Team 2 began moving through the residential sections, finding terrified civilians hiding in sealed compartments, and Team 3, led by Nicole with Brandon at her side, moved deeper into the station toward the sound of combat. They found the pirates on the 3rd level, a mixed group of various species armed with heavy weapons and forcing civilians into a central cargo bay. 12 hostiles, Nicole whispered, her combat scanner feeding information to the team. Approximately 30 civilians in immediate danger. She looked at Brandon. Remember your training. We protect the civilians first. Everything else is secondary. Brandon nodded, his mind racing through the scenarios they had practiced. Nicole gave quick hand signals, and the team spread out to surrounding positions. Then, she stepped into the open corridor, and her voice rang out clearly. This is Lieutenant Commander Nicole Hayes of the Galactic Military Academy. You are in violation of multiple interstellar laws. Release the civilians and surrender immediately. The pirates turned toward her voice, and their leader, a massive Brutok with scarred green skin, laughed. 1 small human woman and a few cadets? He growled. We have been raiding stations for 10 years. Fleet Command does not scare us. I am not Fleet Command, Nicole replied calmly. Then everything happened at once. Nicole moved, and Brandon had trained with her long enough now to follow her tactics. She went high while he went low, their team spreading to flank the pirates while creating protective corridors for the civilians. The pirates opened fire. But Nicole was already somewhere else, moving through their positions like a ghost. Brandon saw her disarm one pirate with a precise strike, disable another with a move he recognized from their training sessions, and drive a third back with suppressing fire. He focused on his own assignment, leading two members of his team to shepherd civilians away from the combat zone. One pirate moved to intercept them, weapon raised toward a terrified human child. Brandon did not hesitate. He put himself between the pirate and the child, taking the impact of the weapon blast on his armor shielding. And in the same motion, he struck back with a combination Nicole had drilled into him hundreds of times. The pirate went down, and Brandon grabbed the child and ran for cover. All civilians clear of the main area. Lisa Chun reported over the team channel. Nicole's voice came back instantly, completely calm despite the chaos. Team 3, fall back to secondary positions. Let them come to us. Brandon understood immediately. They had rescued the civilians, which meant the pirates no longer had hostages to hide behind now. The tactical situation favored the Academy team. The pirates tried to press their attack, but they were used to fighting scared civilians and unprepared security forces. They were not prepared for a coordinated military unit led by someone who had survived impossible battles. Nicole directed her team with precision, using their positioning and timing to make 12 pirates seem like they were facing 40 opponents. Brandon fought beside her, following her commands, protecting his teammates, and applying every lesson she had taught him. When it was over, all 12 pirates were captured or disabled, and not a single civilian had been seriously injured. Brandon stood among the aftermath, breathing hard, and realized that his hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the intense focus. Finally releasing, Nicole approached him, her armor scorched and damaged, but her eyes bright. You did well, Cadet Velrix, she said. I froze for a moment, Brandon admitted. When I saw that pirate aiming at the child, I almost could not move. But you did move, Nicole replied. You put yourself in harm's way to protect someone who could not protect themselves. That is what warriors do. She paused. That is what you have become. Later, as the fleet ships arrived to secure the station and process the prisoners, Brandon found himself standing with his team near the docking bay. Lisa Chun approached them. You all performed like veterans out there, she said. I would not have believed it if I had not seen it. One of Brandon's teammates, a human cadet named Kyle, shook his head in amazement. 6 weeks ago, we could barely coordinate a training drill, he said. Now we just completed a real hostage rescue. We had a good teacher, Brandon said, simply. When they returned to the academy, word of their successful mission had already spread, and students lined the corridors to watch the team disembark. Commander Morrison met them personally, and his expression mixed pride with relief. Well done, he said. Fleet Command has already sent their commendations. He looked at Nicole. They also mentioned that perhaps the Academy should consider more active deployment of our training teams for emergency situations. Nicole's expression suggested she had opinions about that, but she simply nodded. The following week, Brandon stood in front of the entire cadet assembly to receive a commendation for his actions during the rescue, and he took the opportunity to say something that had been on his mind. When I first came to this academy, he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall, I believed that strength came from physical power and warrior.